What do the Jets need to do to make 2023 a successful season? Do they need to make the playoffs? I say yes, and I'll explain why on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, February 23rd, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, we had so many great mailbag questions this week that I've decided that today we're going to do a bonus mailbag. Sometimes I'll do that through the offseason. Our typical mailbag show is Wednesday, but there are weeks where we get so many good questions that it makes sense to do another mailbag, so that's what we're going to do today. Thank you again for everybody who sent in so many great questions. In fact, so many great questions that we are able to do 2 different mailbags this week. Our first question, John, what would you consider a successful 2023? What are your criteria? Making the playoffs, even if it's one and done? A good draft? Quinnen Williams playing well? Something else? It's a great question. And listen, I think the draft has to be good. I think the Jets, if they're going to continue to move in the right direction, need to have another good draft. 2022 is an excellent draft. It's probably the best thing Joe Douglas has done since he's been here. In fact, I'd go as far as to say, I'm not sure Joe Douglas still has a job without this rookie class because a lot of the other stuff he's tried has not worked out. I think the rookie class of 2022 has probably bought him another year. But, I think we're to the point now where the Jets are kind of like a regular NFL team. Over the last, 5-6 years, it feels like we've been grading them on a curve. It's seemed like we couldn't realistically expect the playoffs at the start of the season, where we had to use vague terms like progress and trajectory and moving in the right direction. And fortunately, the Jets at least seem like they're now out of the bottom of the league after a 7-win season. A season that, is kind of disappointing, the fact that they only ended with 7 wins, but still a season where the Jets got themselves back to the middle of the pack. And I think a December collapse is a much more relatable problem to the rest of the NFL than what we've seen, where you're just picking, top 10 every single year, and many years top 5. So now we're back to, probably somewhere in the middle of the NFL. And I always say that, the middle is very big in the NFL. The difference between a 6-11 team and an 11-6 team is not as big as you think. It's really maybe a couple injuries here, a little luck with your schedule, maybe a fortunate bounce to the ball or two. It's, I think at the very bottom you have your teams that are just terrible in this, like Houston, teams in that neighborhood. Then at the top you have your Kansas Cities of the world, which are great, and there are a couple other teams in each category, but most of the NFL is in the middle, where the teams are, generally pretty close in talent. They're not equal in talent, but close enough in talent that in a season with a small sample size, 17 games, there's not that big of a difference, and a lot of it comes down to factors beyond your control. So the Jets, I think, are back in the middle of the pack, but something? We've gone 12 years with no playoffs now, especially after last year, where you start 5-2, where you start 6-3. By the way, 6-3 coming off a huge win against the Buffalo Bills heading into your bye, and of course 7-4 heading into December. To miss the playoffs, that's tough under any circumstances, but it's especially tough when you've had that long of a playoff drought. The Jets currently have missed the playoffs the last 12 seasons. And that's not just the longest drought in the league. It's like the longest drought in the league by 5 years. It's not. There's no team that's even been close to this level of futility. So, the Jets have talked about building this up, but listen. I'm all about progress. I'm all about giving people time to build. But we've reached a point now where there's been time to build. Where Joe Douglas is entering, I guess you could say it's technically season 5. I'd say it's more technically season 4. It's really season 3 of this build. And Robert Saleh is on season 3. And I'm sorry, 3 years in the NFL is good enough. That's long enough to overhaul your roster. It's long enough to overhaul your roster maybe 1.5 times. So you've had a chance to see what did not work. Early in Joe Douglas's tenure was an awful lot. So I think at some point there has to be standards. We've used the phrase, it's not all about wins and losses. And that was true to a certain point. I think when you're at the beginning of your build, you have to judge it based on vaguer terms. But we're to the point where progress has to be measured by making the playoffs. Because how can you make progress coming off a 7-10 season and not make the playoffs? I mean, you're going to tell me 8-9's progress this year? It's not enough progress if it is, even if it is one more win. So in my mind, it's playoffs or bust. Now, these other things are important. Again, if you're looking long run, Jets really do need another good draft to supplement this blue chip talent the Jets brought in last year. Quinnen Williams needs to continue to play well, but I view like Quinnen Williams playing well would be a cause of the Jets making the playoffs. It wouldn't be something alone that you could say makes for a successful season. So I just can't conceive of a scenario where the Jets have a good season and miss the playoffs. So I guess the one caveat would be a couple of years ago, I think it was 2020, the Dolphins won 10 games and missed the playoffs, and they were just kind of a tough luck playoff team. I guess if you told me, okay, the Jets are going to win 10, they're just going to, be in an AFC where 10 isn't good enough. Okay, maybe then you could sell me that that's enough of an improvement because the Jets at least would have a winning record. They have double-digit wins for the first time since 2015. I think that would be an accomplishment. But realistically, the Jets are probably making the playoffs. I think it's a very unlikely. It's possible, but it's a very unlikely scenario that the Jets would miss the playoffs at 10 wins. I think it has to be a winning season. I think it has to be a playoff season, though. We're 3 years in. And at some point, you need to have results. And I was patient. Listen, I understood this. And I think you needed to understand that Joe Douglas took over a team that he really could not start building for 2 years. He had the 2020 draft, but he inherited a team at a very awkward point where the Jets had just pretty much spent 2 years' worth of cap space in 2019 at the point he was hired. So it was going to take a while, and it was going to require patience. But patience is not infinite. And we're at a point where they really do. If Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh are doing their jobs effectively, you really should start seeing results right now. I don't think that there's much of a doubt about that. So I think I just can't see a scenario outside of like that hard luck 10-win scenario where you could call this a successful season and the Jets have missed the playoffs. Next question. Do the Jets win both Patriots games last year with Derek Carr under center? I think probably. You can never say with 100% certainty because who knows? Maybe one of those is a terrible day for Carr. Everybody has really bad games, and sometimes I think even the best quarterbacks, guys who are better than Carr, have games where they cost their team. So I can't say with 100% certainty, but I mean, let's be serious here. The Jets get credible quarterback play in either of those games, they win. And they really were just a decent quarterback performance away from sweeping the Patriots, and that would have put them at 9-8. And I mean, you could point to some other games Zach Wilson did not play very well in that probably cost the Jets. So, yeah, I think probably they do. And I think if the Jets, if Derek Carr was at quarterback last year, the Jets probably make the playoffs. In fact, I mean, I think you could argue if Sam Darnold was the quarterback last year, the Jets would make the playoffs. That's just how rough of a season it was for Zach Wilson. I think there's also a danger in assuming that everything's going to play out exactly the same if you get Derek Carr. There are other factors that are going to change the season. You're not dropping Derek Carr to the 2022 Jets scenario where the team was just a quarterback away from making the playoffs. Now, if the Jets get Carr, I think they have an excellent chance of making the playoffs, but it's a different season. You're going to face different opponents. There are going to be different injuries. There are going to be different challenges, different forms of adversity that pop up through the season. Hopefully not guys demanding trades or anything like that, but it's just going to be a different thing. So I think there is danger in, and this is something teams do every year, where they say, well, we were at 7 wins last year. We added this guy and this guy and this guy. It's impossible we win less than 7 this year. Well, it's not impossible. There are scenarios that break down that things don't go your way. But yeah, listen, Derek Carr probably puts the Jets in the playoffs last year, and I would imagine, unless he just had a nightmare game, the Jets probably sweep the Patriots last year because the Patriots team, frankly, was not very good, and Jets really could have won both of those games, and they should have won the first game. The game in MetLife was a game that they really let slip away, and they were right there in Foxborough. But the game in MetLife is the one that I think really bothers you. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue our bonus mailbag, and we'll talk about the topic everyone wants to talk about, the quarterback position, what are the Jets going to do. I'll give you a couple guesses as we continue this Thursday mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's the offseason in the NFL. We're talking about potential moves the Jets can make. We're looking back on the 2022 season, but the NBA season's still happening. And now's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. And there are even some bets you can take about the NFL offseason, which quarterbacks are going where. You can put your money down if you have a sense of where you think the Jets are going to go at the quarterback position. And FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This show's free and available on all platforms. We're continuing our bonus Thursday mailbag show. Our next question, John, we are all anticipating the Jets' move at quarterback. As fans, there are so many variables depending on the media source. In your professional opinion, who did the Jets end up signing? And more importantly, how do you think it will work out? Well, I want to make it clear that this is not based on any insider information I've got at the moment. So this is just my guess. And as you said, it varies by the week. It feels like it varies by the media source. Last week, the Packers were ready to move on from Aaron Rodgers. This week now, people are saying, well, the Packers want to keep Aaron Rodgers. And I said this yesterday. The best I could piece this together with the Packers based on the varying pieces of information we've got is the one thing that you hear this week about the Packers wanting to keep Aaron Rodgers is that they want him fully committed. And it almost sounds like when you combine that with last week's reports about how they were done with him, they just didn't feel like he was completely bought in last year. They didn't feel like he was completely focused on football. There was talk maybe he didn't come in top-notch shape, which becomes really important as you get older as a quarterback. And I think that's the biggest thing that people miss about Tom Brady. People look at today's NFL and they say, well, you can't hit the quarterback. That means quarterbacks can last until the mid-40s. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think, you look, Drew Brees was a shell of himself by the end. Peyton Manning was one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL the year Denver won its Super Bowl in 2015. Phillip Rivers was kind of declining by the end. Matt Ryan looks like he's finished. So I don't think you can really reasonably expect a guy to play into his 40s unless he's just really in top-notch shape. So you get the sense, though, this week, and it could change next week again. These rumors, one of the things I kind of come to dislike about this time of year is that you hear wildly different reports. Some of them conflict with each other, so it's difficult to sort out fact from fiction. In the end, somebody will be proven right, somebody will be proven wrong, but all the buzz right now seems to be that the Jets are in on Carr. And here's the other thing about Carr. It doesn't seem like there's that much interest in him. I mean, we know New Orleans is interested in him, but I just don't know that there's the market I was expecting for Carr. And that could change at any moment. I did not think the Jets were that interested in Carr a week or two ago, and that changed. So these developments can always change. But at this point in time, I kind of feel like they're going to get Carr. And my opinion could be different by tomorrow. It could be different by the time you listen to this podcast. But it sounds like all the buzz is that the Jets are the team that's most interested in Derek Carr at the moment. And it's kind of logical. And I actually thought back 2 years because back in 2021, when the Jets had the second pick, they needed a quarterback. Sam had not worked out. And I remember, I suggested maybe a bridge quarterback along the lines of, there were a couple names out there, but I suggested maybe getting a veteran in to stabilize things for a couple of years. And there was a very negative reaction when I did that. And I think that that's true of fans, and I think it's true of GMs. I think GMs want to bring it. The allure of the young quarterback with the unlimited potential is more attractive to a lot of teams than maybe a stabilizing presence like a Derek Carr, who's just, who's good but not great, where you're not getting a guy who's necessarily going to lift you to a Super Bowl, but you're getting a guy who's a quality player. I think the allure of the young quarterback, the allure of the rookie contract where you don't have to spend much at quarterback and you can spread your money across the rest of the team and really build up the roster. I think that those things come into play. I think those are reasons why maybe there's not as big of a market for Carr. Meanwhile, when you look at the Jets, you have guys whose jobs are on the line, and Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh, and they kind of can't. They really can't go to a rookie next year because their job's on the line, and rookies, even really good rookies, frequently have growing pains. So they need a guy who can go in there, play effectively, and save their job. The second part of that question was, how will it go with Derek Carr? And I wish I could give you a better answer. I feel like anything could happen. I feel like it could go well, it could go poorly. I just think it's a chance the Jets need to take right now. Carr could decline early. Last year was not a very good year for him. We know he's not a great quarterback. We know he's not a guy who's going to the Hall of Fame, despite whatever that weird report was about Jets telling Carr he's a first ballot Hall of Fame. I don't know what was going on with that, but I mean, we know Carr's not going to the Hall of Fame. So I think the best case scenario is he stabilizes things. He gets the Jets back to the playoffs. He ends the playoff drought. He takes the Jets to the playoffs a couple of years. Maybe once or twice he goes on a run. But more than anything, he gives the Jets the benefit of time. He allows the Jets to pick the right quarterback for them in the draft, allows the Jets to bring that quarterback along slowly, and then he eventually gives way to that quarterback. The worst case scenario, I think, is one where it just doesn't work out, where the Jets get him next year and they're stuck in this big contract and he's in decline, and this past year with the Raiders was a sign that he's not going anywhere. I guess if you're looking for like a guess from me, I'd have to say usually I like to go in the middle of the two extremes where Carr is effective but he's not great, and I feel like the most likely scenario with Carr is that people will debate him. Some people will say, well, he's better than what we've had, and other people will say, well, that's still not good enough. I feel like there's maybe he's one of those guys where we'll never get a resolution on how good he really is. That's a different scenario because it was about injuries, but I feel like that's kind of where a lot of Jets fans are with Chad Pennington. There's always a great debate about, was Chad Pennington good enough, because Chad Pennington's better than anything that's come since him, but people still feel like there was a ceiling on Chad Pennington. So maybe somewhere along those lines, for different reasons though. Carr's been much more durable than Pennington, and a lot of the question marks with Pennington were mainly due to injuries. Next question. The defense stayed relatively healthy last season. How much regression are you expecting next season for this defense? It's unlikely they will be as lucky injury-wise. Well, I think the question is who gets injured, because I think this defense's success was really based on a handful of players. I don't think it was an 11-man dominant unit. I think there were a handful of great players and a handful of really good players who helped this unit get where it needed to go. So Quinnen Williams, Sauce Gardner. Those guys stay healthy. There's only so much the defense can fall. When you have two all-pro players, there's only so bad your defense can be, because those guys are playing at a top-notch level, especially when one of them's on the defensive line and one of them's at corner, because they help shut down the passing game. So there's only so much your defense can fall with those guys. And then you have your second-tier guys, your John Franklin Myerses, your DJ Reeds, and even your Carl Lawsons. Now, Lawson may be gone, and I think that's one area where you may look to regression. The question is whether Jermaine Johnson could fill that role if the Jets cut Carl Lawson. And if they bring Lawson back, then it's kind of a moot point. But, it's a question of whether those guys get injured. And I don't know that there's any reason to necessarily expect any of those guys is going to get hurt. Are the Jets going to have 11 healthy starters through the season? No, but you can afford to lose some starters more than others. So I don't think it's as dire of a situation as you might think, even a year where you had relatively good injury luck, because it's all about your key players. If your key players stay healthy, they're going to be fine, and I don't think they're going to regress all that much. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out this mailbag episode. We'll talk about some concerns about Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson entering year 2. May the Jets ask them to bulk up? May that impact them negatively? We'll discuss further as we continue this mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here, this Thursday mailbag show, a bonus mailbag for this week. We continue. Last season, the Jets had Elijah Moore bulk up a bit, and that seems to have caused him to not be as quick and fast on the field. Do you worry if the team does the same with Sauce and Garrett Wilson, who are both slight in frame and probably could use some bulking up? If they do this, could they both lose a step as well? That's a great point about Moore. It seemed to me like he was not anywhere near as explosive in 2022 as he was in 2021. And you're right, he did bulk up in the offseason. And I think sometimes these teams overthink this stuff. Look, Elijah Moore's a small guy. He's not strong. He's not going to be a great contested catch guy, no matter what you do. I mean, you could add as much muscle to his frame as you want. he's undersized. You have to play to your strengths. And I think that, looking back, that may have been, if it was something the team directed, from the strength and conditioning staff, that might be one that just was ill-advised. And it might be something the Jets look to change this offseason. I think there's less of a danger with it with Sauce and Garrett Wilson, though, than there was with Elijah Moore, because I think Elijah Moore's 2021 was good for a rookie. And there's a difference between good for a rookie and good for a veteran. Good for a rookie means you show some life. It means you show something. I mean, pretty much draft picks get graded, especially as rookies, get graded on a very easy curve. Essentially, you show any sort of life, you're viewed as somebody who has promise, you're viewed as somebody who's got a future in the league. And I think, sometimes as fans, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, and I was pretty guilty of it with Elijah Moore, you want to believe somebody's going to be great. And Elijah Moore showed you signs that maybe he could be great. He also showed signs that maybe he's not going to be so great. But you choose to believe that maybe he's going to be great because you want to believe. And maybe Elijah Moore is not as good as we hoped he would be, and that happens a lot. Whereas Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson, they weren't good for rookies. They were good for anybody. They're already star players in this league. They're not future stars. They're not guys who showed promise. They're guys who already look like stars. So I think when you're trying to get a player to take the next step, as the Jets were with Elijah Moore last year, you approach things differently than maybe you do with guys who are already firmly established as stars in this league. So I don't know why you would even mess around with Garrett Wilson or Sauce Gardner. Now, I think, I actually do think Sauce could probably add some muscle to his frame without sacrificing a lot of athletic ability. But, you don't mess around with this stuff. When the guy's playing, when your players are as good as Sauce and Garrett, I think you're less inclined to mess with what's working, as you might be with Elijah, a guy who showed promise, but still needed to add that something extra. Unfortunately, that something extra was not, muscle. I don't think Elijah Moore is ever going to be a physical player. Elijah Moore's game is based on speed, and the Jets just need to maximize that. I mean, that's just my view, and people can disagree with that, but I think that you play to a player's strengths, and as much as you'd like to improve weaknesses, sometimes it's just not plausible. Sometimes it's not in the best interest of the player. Our next question: our esteemed offensive coordinator has deployed a dual running back run game, especially during the Aaron Jones years in Green Bay. Do you think the Jets will look for a big addition at running back depth, or are they happy with the Breece Hall-Michael Carter combo? I get the sense that they're happy with what they've got, because you've also got Bam Knight in there, and you've also got James Robinson. Now, this is a group that I think on paper could be very good, and it was a group I was very optimistic about heading into the season. And Breece Hall was really the only one who lived up to the hype. Outside of Bam Knight had a couple games where it felt like, especially those first 3 games, it really felt like Bam Knight, the Jets had found something. And then he kind of regressed near the end of the season. And, it was exciting those first 3 weeks. I was saying, and I think he even won, there was this ridiculous award Pepsi gives out every week for rookies, and the Jets won it almost every week this season. And Bam Knight even got his share of the Pepsi. And Breece Hall had won Pepsi. Garrett Wilson was the Pepsi rookie a couple times. Sauce was, the Jets were the greatest team in Pepsi history in 2022. Bam Knight, got off to a really hot start and then kind of cooled off. James Robinson he had one moment in that game-winning drive against Buffalo, but outside of that, he really never lived up to it. I think on paper it could be good. It was a very disappointing second season for Michael Carter. I was expecting much more out of him. James Robinson was a good, much better player in Jacksonville than he was with the Jets. So this is like a group that could be really good. I don't know that you really go out and add somebody, though. And I think the other wild card to this is Breece going to be himself right off the bat, or is it going to take another year? We know Breece is going to be on the field next year, but there's a difference between Breece Hall, who's still showing lingering signs of this, because you can show lingering signs of a knee injury and still be healthy enough to play and not really be endangering yourself. But sometimes it takes more than a year to recover from an injury like Breece has. So that's the question. I think there's enormous question marks in this running back position heading into it. I think it's one of those positions that the outcome has a wide variety of wide variety of possibilities. It could be great. It could be as bad as we saw last year. In fact, it could be worse than we saw last year if Breece is not fully recovered from his injury. I get the sense, though, that there's enough promise there that the Jets are going to want to just stick with what they've got. And, if they have to make a move in midseason, if they have to make a trade, it should not be that hard to get a running back at the deadline. So I think they'll probably see what they got and go from there. And if they need to make a move, I think my guess is that it will happen mid-season rather than during the offseason. And our last question is from Chris. One question I have is, how did things go from everybody saying the Jets had $15 to $16 million of cap space, then the NFL raised the cap by a few $1 million, Now suddenly the Jets are over the cap. Any chance you could help explain what happened there? Not exactly. So I'm not sure where the projections from 15 to $16 million came from. I don't recall them. So I do know the Jets are currently a little bit over the salary cap. The thing to remember, though, is that the current cap number is not necessarily representative of the team's true cap space. And what I mean from that is that a lot of contracts are maneuverable. There are contracts you can renegotiate to lower the player's cap number, and there are also players you can cut to create cap space. So if the Jets wanted to, they could get to like $50 million under the cap pretty easily with a couple of cuts. Now, the only caveat to that, and I think this is a caveat people forget, is that you are cutting players. And I think with the Jets particularly, we've been used to having these rosters with overpriced guys who really don't contribute much. This year, if the Jets cut, they are going to be cutting guys who are starters who will need to be replaced. And that could be a Carl Lawson. It could be a Corey Davis. There are a couple other guys, Jordan Whitehead, I'm not a big fan of, but at least is somewhat of a credible safety. So that's the only caveat this year, is that you're not cutting the Trumaine Johnsons anymore. You're not cutting guys who really aren't bringing much to the table, the Ben Ajalanas, my favorite contract of all time. You are cutting guys who are going to need to be replaced, and part of the money you gain from cutting them is probably going to need to go towards a replacement, unless you have an in-house option like maybe Jermaine Johnson would be for Carl Lawson. But I don't know exactly where the 15 to 16 million under the cap figure came from. I believe it was out there. I don't know where it came from, but the important thing to remember, the cap's kind of a moving figure, and it's also as much about your ability to maneuver as it is your total cap number at the moment. And the Jets, this is not going to be an offseason where the Jets are going to be able to spend a ton of money, because in today's NFL, for what the Jets need, 50, 60, even to get to $50, $60 million, it actually doesn't go as far as you'd think. It doesn't really even go that far. I think that's the type of money where you have maybe a couple of priority moves that are really important to you, but you're not going to be able to overhaul your roster the way the Jets did last year, the way the Jets have done the last couple of years. So that's something to keep in mind as we head into the offseason. The situation is probably not as dire as the over the cap figure would currently suggest, and the Jets, slightly over the cap, but it's not a situation where the Jets are going to be able to do a tremendous amount of work on their team, unless they really just want to mortgage their future and just push all the dead money into the future. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.